Welcome to the unknown broadcast. Take one, take two. Welcome to the unknown webcast. Just to eliminate any doubt, you should know that I am so conservative I have trouble turning left even when I'm driving. This is broadcast number 27, and we'll be talking with Bill McKeever from Mormonism Research Ministry on this edition of the unknown webcast about polygamy, the next step in sexual norms. My name is Don Vino. I'm president of Midwest Christian Outreach, Inc. in Wonder Lake, Illinois, which produces the Unknown Webcast. And our senior researcher is Ron Hensel, who will introduce the sponsors of tonight's webcast.
Welcome from tropically depressed Florida, where we are seeing a lot of wind and rain right now, but we want to tell you who is bringing our webcast to you tonight. First of all, we are brought to you by World's End Theology Outlet, your one-stop destination for dubious doctrines, half-baked heresies, and other notions whose time has gone. World's End Theology Outlet. And it's time to take your relationships out on the town with Date a City. Date a City. Take your relationships to a whole new level with Date a City. Back to you, Don. Well, actually, as soon as I figure out, I told you this is going to be a problem. Let me escape. Okay, are we back?
And now we're going.
When you don't know what to do.
Well, you did want to practice, and what better way than to do it live?
I'm practicing, yeah.
Practicing. Well, you know, it's like a practicing physician. They never actually become an expert. They just keep practicing.
I was looking for that little button that said stop sharing, and it was nowhere to be seen. So
it was, yeah. So you couldn't stop. And Bill McKeever, it is good to have you with us again tonight.
Good to be with you guys.
And I noticed, in fact, we were talking just a little bit before we started that you all were at a temple opening last week.
Yeah, in fact, Eric is still there. I had to come back because I had things to do, including this. So, yeah, we were out at the Fort Collins temple opening. That's the second temple, I believe, in the state of Colorado. And it's been quite interesting out there. We do little different things. Eric was over near where the people had to walk past him, which is very unusual. Normally when we do temple outreaches, it seems like the Mormon Church tries very hard to make sure that the people never come in contact with us. And so in cases like that, we utilize website signs, and one of our favorite URLs for a temple opening is sacredorsecret.com. And that is something that people can remember, and it's also based on a statement that Mormons probably hear a lot. When you ask, is your temple ceremony secret, they'll say, no, it's sacred, not secret. So it's a phrase that even a Mormon would probably remember. And so we get a lot of people working on the web wanting to know more information on that. But we've had some very positive comments. Some Christians that have gone through the temple there have been very thankful for the information in the 4-page newspaper that we're handing out. And so we're very pleased that we are getting the word out, and who knows how many Mormons are out there having questions about what they believe, maybe perhaps even about the temple itself. Because, as you know, Don, when you go through a temple open house, they don't tell you everything that goes on in the temple. They are very vague. And in this one in particular, they show you a film before you go through it. And the film gives you the impression that if I was just to merely join the Mormon Church, I would be together with my family forever. And of course, if you have a family that you like, that sounds like something that might be worth looking into. Yeah. Unfortunately, that's not how it is. In order to be with your family, you have to meet certain requirements in Mormonism. And of course, those requirements, I personally feel, are unreachable because they include keeping all of the commandments, which who is doing that? And plus, it also includes repentance. Now, that might not seem a little bit odd, since in Christianity we certainly have a doctrine of repentance, but in Mormonism, repentance isn't merely a turning away or an acknowledgement that you've done something wrong and you want to turn away and do do better from that point on, if you will, it's actually a 100% success rate. Because in Mormonism, if you sin that same sin again, your former sins return, according to Section 82 in the Doctrine and Covenants, which is a part of Mormon scripture. So,
yeah, definition is always important. Our blog this
yeah.
this past week was preventing liability, and it kind of started with that sort of thing. What is the context of the statements? What is the context of a passage? What are the definitions of the terms that we are using? And we find that a lot of deception happens just by using the same word but giving it a new definition.
Mormonism is notorious for that. They use just about all the words that we would probably use in our Christianese dictionary. And of course, they do have different definitions, such as even the word grace. Now, some people say, well, Mormons don't have a doctrine of grace. Well, they certainly do. It's just this idea of grace is known to them as an enabling power, which enables them to keep all the commandments. So if they don't keep all the commandments, then it's obviously their fault. But you don't get the grace that forgives you until you've denied yourself of all ungodliness. Then you get the grace that actually forgives you of your sins. So you can see the big difference between us and our LDS friends is in Christianity, you get the forgiveness of sins at the very beginning of your Christian journey, but in Mormonism, you only get forgiveness basically at the end if you're good enough to achieve it.
Okay, let me give out a definition and see if this sounds similar to what you just described. Someone would say that grace is God giving you the power and ability to do His will joyfully. Is that similar to what Mormonism would teach?
Yes. Is that something from a Catholic text?
No, that comes from Bill Gothard and the Institute of Basic Life Principles.
Wow. Yeah, because that doctrine of grace in Mormonism is very similar to the Catholic doctrine of infusion, and that the believer is infused with this grace that enables them to keep the necessary commandments. So they can still say they're saved by grace, but of course that certainly wouldn't be the definition that we would understand Paul to be saying.
Right. And we're going to be talking more about those kinds of things as this webcast develops. But our main topic tonight really was kind of started off because I saw this news story about Kody Brown. And for those who don't know who that is, he has a show on TLC with his several wives called Sister Wives. And he has 4 of them, apparently, 4 wives.
I believe you're correct on that. Yes.
Meri, Janelle, Christine, and Robyn. And they have 17 children. So they're taking their views on marriage to the Supreme Court, and apparently the Supreme Court is going to hear their case, it's looking like. Because they're seeking to have polygamous marriage as legal as same-gender marriage. Now, that sounds odd because you would say, well, it should be as legal as monogamous marriage, but no, same-gender marriage took the next step into neutralizing marriage effectively.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I get asked that a lot. Do you think that polygamy is eventually going to be legalized? And our spiritual condition of this country is so whacked right now, who knows what's going to happen. But it seems to me that once they got rid of the moral high ground when it came to same-sex marriage, just about everything is open now. Because if you're going to basically define marriage as something that's for people who just happen to have love, fidelity, devotion, sacrifice, and family, that opens up a pretty wide door as to how that can be defined. And what I find is interesting is that a lot of homosexual activists don't want polygamy to be legalized. And this might surprise you. There's a lot of polygamists that don't want polygamy legalized because once it's legalized, the position of their wives having children, because in the eyes of the state, remember, polygamy is not legal right now, not even in Utah. In fact, we're, I think, the only state in the union that has an anti-polygamy clause in our Constitution. And so a lot of the polygamists don't want it to be legal because right now they can do what one group has called bleeding the beast, and that was Warren Jeff's group, I think, that used that phrase. And what they do is the women are allowed to get welfare because they are considered by the state to be single mothers. And if that was to change and polygamy became legal, that benefit, I am sure, is going to disappear. And, you know, having to support all those wives that you feel God told you to take is going to be a little difficult on an income, especially here in Utah, which is pretty bad. So,
Wow.
Now, Warren Jeffs, which group is that for those who don't know?
he's the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He's the one that's currently in jail. But he still rules kind of like a mafia don from prison. So his organization still goes on. I'm sure he's been hampered somewhat, not being there personally, but from what I read, he's still running the show. He and his brother. So.
What were you going to say, Ron?
Well, I haven't really thought. So you say the. Why would gays and lesbians be against legalizing polygamy?
You know, I don't know, but I remember listening to all the talk shows before the Supreme Court ruling Obergefell came through, and I was amazed that whenever some homosexual spokesmen were on, they were always speaking ill of polygamy, and I was wondering, well, why would you not think that could be the next step? And it was almost like, well, no, because that's not right. And I'm thinking, well, how are you defining what's right? I mean, everything's turned on its head nowadays. What's your basis for truth and error on this one? I don't know. But apparently, there are some that are saying, no, it's not going to happen. Polygamy's not going to happen. And some have even given some reasons as to why it shouldn't. I'm looking at this article from Politico titled "No, Polygamy Isn't the Next Gay Marriage," written by a guy by the name of Jonathan Rauch, I think is how he pronounces it.
Right, he is a gay activist. Jonathan Rauch is a gay activist, right?
Yeah, and he makes an interesting argument here about by allowing high-status men to hoard wives at the expense of lower-status men, polygamy withdraws the opportunity to marry from people who now have it. Same-sex marriage, by contrast, extends the opportunity to marry to people who now lack it. So I guess he's thinking that if we allow polygamy to happen, there won't be any more women around, and that's going to cause all sorts of chaos in our culture. I don't know if he has any real hard facts to back that up. He says he does in this article, but I guess that would remain to be seen, wouldn't it? But I would say, if I'm coming from a polygamist point of view, I would say, why not? You know, you got what you wanted. Why can't we get what we want? At least the plumbing works in our situation, right?
Well, you know, when you say chaos in our culture, let me think about this for a second. So we now have same-gender relationships they're calling marriage, and it's legally looked at as marriage. We have now decreed by the Department of Education that boys should be able to use the shower rooms of girls if they feel feminine that day, and you cannot deny them. We have now 27 different gender identifications.
71.
Pardon?
Now, come on, Don. You know that's what the founding fathers meant, right? You know the founding fathers had that in mind, right?
There are now 71 different gender.
71. It's growing by the week, it seems like.
It's Facebook made the mistake of creating a field. You could choose male, female, or custom. When you choose custom, it gives you this field. You could, in the beginning, you could enter just about anything you wanted into it. So people were choosing genders like mustard, or sky, or something like that. So they had to somehow limit them. And originally it was like 58, and now it's gotten up to 71 terms that are acceptable in that field. So yeah, Tumblr is about the same.
Tumblr is about the same. So when you say about chaos in culture, I think we've arrived.
Oh yeah, I definitely do. And what's really strange is the Christians are the weird ones now. I mean, as I was mentioning on Church Sunday, I says Christianity is no longer the darling religion of the United States. That's for sure. We're the enemy. I mean, you can't even criticize these people and their behavior without being accused of some type of hateful act. And that's unfortunate because that kind of ad hominem only stifles good intellectual dialogue. And what that tells me is intellectual dialogue is no longer allowed. It's no longer to be received. It's going to be this way or no way.
Well,
people,
yeah, go ahead.
people have been saying for some time, in fact for 20 years, and now it's more true than 20 years ago, that the culture we now live in has never been as much like the culture of the first century, that the first century church lived in, than it is today. I heard this 20, 25 years ago, and now, I mean, well, here's an example. The Emperor Nero took his slave boy, had him castrated, and then he married him.
And that was unusual. See, that's what's interesting. Is
right.
Nero's situation, wanting to marry him, was unusual. That, as far as I know in history, that was not the norm.
Well, especially for a Roman, it was unusual. The Romans referred to homosexuality as Greek love. Mm-hmm. So it had been more prominent, and still was more prominent in Greek culture in Roman days. But it had been creeping up in Roman society. Julius Caesar, and after that, going back at least as far as Julius Caesar, it was known that these Caesars, these emperors, were practicing to some extent homosexuality, and it was frowned upon by the masses. I think that is kind of where we are today. I think what's happened is the masses have been intimidated into silence.
Oh, I think you're right. Because if you raise any objection, you're automatically labeled.
You get into a real head-to-head, heart-to-heart conversation with your family members, your neighbors, and it's just really, they wouldn't do it, they don't condone it, but they're not going to say anything because they don't want to be labeled. Mm-hmm. They don't want to be mean, they don't want to be hateful, but frankly it makes their skin crawl, a lot of this stuff. But there's a sincere desire, I think, to be accepting of people, while at the same time not knowing, just not wanting to express what you really think about these behaviors.
Well, I think what's tragic in our culture, because I remember when I was in high school back in the 70s, and this was starting to happen at that time, and it was always stay out of our bedroom. That was the big chant that you would hear, stay out of our bedroom. Well, I knew back then, even as a dumb kid, that was a lie. Certainly it was going to go beyond the bedroom, and this is what we're seeing. I would not be surprised if down the road that the churches are going to be threatened with their tax-exempt status and such if they even speak on these issues. It wouldn't surprise me at all. So that's obviously outside the bedroom.
I don't think it's in a too far distant future even. And what you're talking about, actually, we wrote on in our blogging about 2 weeks ago on something called The Art of Manipulation. And in there, I don't know if you had a chance to read that because you've been kind of busy out there picking on those poor Mormons in Utah.
No, they're in Colorado.
We talk, in Colorado. We talked about something called Kafka trapping, which is kind of coined about a book written by Frank Kafka titled The Trial. Ron, you know about the book, right?
Yeah, it's very weird.
It is very weird.
Strange book.
It's a story about it's really about communism, but a low-level bureaucrat is arrested, but never actually charged with a thing. Just sort of general accusations are kind of made. He's put on trial, never really any evidence provided, and then he's executed after he's found guilty. The way it works, this guy Eric Raymond wrote about this, and he says the term Kafka trapping describes a logical fallacy that is popular within gender feminism, racial politics, and other ideologies of victimhood. It occurs when you are accused of a thought crime. Does that sound familiar? Mm-hmm. Such as sexism, racism, or homophobia. You respond with honest denial, which is then used as further confirmation of your guilt. You are now trapped in a secular and unfalsifiable argument. No one who is accused can be innocent because the structure of Kafka trapping precludes that possibility. So you are accused. The more you try to deny the accusation, the more guilty you become because they use those denials against you.
Sunday morning, I was speaking at a church in Fort Collins, and I was speaking from Philippians 1:8, where Paul talks about having love, but having love with knowledge and discernment, and how if we are not a discerning people, really our love can be misguided. And here's the problem I'm seeing, Don Ron. I'm seeing even the word love now is something that I have to ask people to define for me, because I don't know what they even mean by that word anymore. Now, a biblical love would certainly be always wanting the best for others, either temporally in this life or in eternity. We are going to want the best for other people. And I think a true definition of biblical love would be just that, wanting the best for others. What shocks me are so many professing Christians that have just fallen for this position in our culture now, and who actually have concluded that if you are not in favor of supporting this kind of behavior, that you're not showing love. But yet, when I read, for instance, 1 Corinthians 6, when Paul speaks that certain people who practice unrepentantly certain behaviors will not inherit the kingdom of God, and that behavior is one of them that he lists right in the middle of the group, how can a Christian say they have biblical love when they condone a behavior for these people that's going to have eternal consequences for them?
Well, because
Go for it, Professor. Tell us.
Because too many Christians have swapped sound biblical teaching and theology for sound bites, my favorite Bible verses, etc. You have those like Brian McLaren, Rob Bell, Tony Campolo, and others.
But you just mentioned three people that those of us who love the Bible and revere the text look upon as clearly being heretical and outside the norm. And sadly, I think you're right, because there's so much biblical illiteracy within our churches, people look at those guys as if they have something profound to say when they really don't.
Right. Well, because it feels right. It resonates with people because they touch you deeply emotionally, and so it becomes an emotive faith. We have something, I have coined a term that I really like. We have spiritual AIDS, AIDS. It is the acquired ignorance of the doctrines of Scripture. And it is pervasive throughout the church because of the crybaby boomer generation. That's my generation. That's your generation, Bill.
That's my generation, too.
Yeah, the crybaby boomer generation who views themselves as victims for whom emotions rule the day. If it feels good, it must be true. And so you
sounds like a religion I deal with every day here. That's Mormonism. If it feels good, that's something that's true. If it's good feeling, it's true. If it's a bad feeling, it's got to be false. So.
Well, that is correct. And so, you know, that's what we're dealing with. So when we then approach these subjects like polygamy, for example, well, as you pointed out, we just legalized same-gender relationships and called it marriage because the Supreme Court just said this is so. And if you stand against that, what are you doing? Well, you're denying someone the right to happiness. how so? How am I denying anyone the right to happiness? Is happiness only accomplished through sexual congress?
Well,
If
I
that
mean,
is
a
so,
lot of
what kind
people
of
say that.
happiness is that?
Hmm. Yeah.
Okay. Well, happiness is three kinds of ice cream, finding a butterfly, setting it free. Uh, the really, it's like we saw this coming. We've been predicting it at every turn. When we made a prediction that this is where this is heading, they laughed at us,
Right.
they mocked us, they ridiculed us, and the reason they gave is they said, you're just trying to scare people. You're just trying, you're saying today that because gays want to not be harassed for being gay, or you're saying that because we want to extend them benefits or whatever, that therefore one day they will ask to be married. I remember we had a columnist in Chicago named Mike Royko
Oh
back in the
yeah.
70s and 80s. Remember good
I
old
remember
Mike?
that. Hmm.
And he used to just ridicule and mock people who thought that gays wanted to adopt children, who thought that gays wanted to get married. He just thought, you guys are just trying to scare everybody. All they want is just to be left alone. And the truth was, no, they didn't just want to be left alone. They wanted much more than that. Um, and so we warned, we warned, we warned, and now we're we're being ridiculed because we have not changed, but they have. Uh, so what they once thought was to be ridiculed because they agreed with us that it would be a very terrible outcome, or let's just say an an well an outcome that they didn't want either. Now they're okay with it, and now they're ridiculing us, but for a different reason. So I guess we just have to resign ourselves that we're going to be ridiculed no matter what. It's just going to happen.
I think you're absolutely right, Ron. The problem is with most American Christians, in some countries you have to kill Christians to shut them up. In the United States, you just have to label them. And nobody wants to be labeled. And certainly nobody wants to have those horrible labels tagged onto them. But I think what you were talking about is exactly what Frederick DeBoer was saying in his article, It's Time to Legalize Polygamy. His first line, welcome to the exciting new world of the slippery slope. Now, see, what you were talking about,
Right.
we've been saying, and what would be the argument? Oh, you're using a slippery slope fallacy. And I know there's a slippery slope fallacy, but sometimes I think the slippery slope is a good warning because it often does happen.
Yeah, in logic, slippery slope can either be a fallacy or it can be true. Slippery slopes exist. We know that. We see them in nature.
Well, we're talking about one. We're talking about one. I mean, because it happened. It happened.
The difference really is not between no slippery slope and a slippery slope. The difference is between what the people on the slope decide to do. Do they decide to plant their ski poles in the snow and stop from going down the slope or not? So they're on a slippery slope, but one group of people will plant their poles and say, hey, we're not going to go any further down the slope. The next generation comes along, they get out on the slope, they say, hey, we're going all the way down, baby. We see no reason to stop. And we're in that generation now. They're ready to go full bore all the way down.
It's sad.
So.
Well, it's like, I want to bring up Brian McLaren again because we're kind of, we want to go back to this question of polygamy, but on that slippery slope where some did not plant their poles, I like that. That's a good analogy, Ron. Brian McLaren, I don't know, Bill McKeever, if you recall this, but about, 6 or 7 years ago, he had called the church leadership to not make a decision on homosexuality But to give it about 5 years, to pray about it and see what God was directing us to understand about this, and then make a decision. And, obviously I had a problem with that because God has already spoken on this. It wasn't a secret.
Yes, he has.
Sexual sin is sexual sin. Now, some have contacted me and say, well, how come you're just coming out against that? And I go, I'm not. I think, sexual sin is sexual sin, whether it's homosexuality, adultery, what is it between two singles?
Fornication.
Fornication, or pedophilia. Go down the range of sexuality. Anything outside the bounds of male-female marriage is sexual sin. That's pretty clear in Scripture.
And what does Paul mention over and over in many of his epistles? He talks about sexual immorality over and over again. Christians were always to be outside of the behavior of the Gentiles. That's a phrase he liked to use. And yet we're hearing arguments now from professing Christians that even sex outside of marriage is okay under certain guidelines. It's like, okay, where are you getting this from the Word? Because I'm not seeing that.
Right. In fact, we just had that in our crux last week. A pastor in Hinsdale, Illinois, was writing that as long as it's loving and consensual and beneficial, sex outside of marriage between singles is perfectly fine.
But do you see, here's the problem. When they use the phrase loving, again, I would say define for me the term, because if in fact the Word says that kind of behavior is going to be met with certain consequences, then it's really not loving for that individual to engage in it, and it should not be condoned by us as believers. But again, even the word love it doesn't have a biblical meaning even among many professing Christians, which is tragic.
Right, because their theology is largely emotive. Ron, I think you have a word from one of our sponsors on this topic.
Well, yes, we do want to hear from one of the sponsors of today's program, and they're asking us the question, has your polygamous marriage become a chore? Is being limited to only a few spouses a bore? Are you looking for something more? Well, it's about time that you started thinking about this, because marriage laws are rapidly changing. Opportunities for entirely new kinds of relationships are opening up almost every day. You don't want to be left behind. That's why you should consider this new service, Date a City. Take your relationship out on the town. Take it to a whole new level. Why limit yourself to just a small group of spouses when you can date an entire city with the prospect of one day, perhaps, when the laws change, having complete and utter matrimony with that city. This week only, Data City is going to open up its profile so that you can browse for free. One of the eligible cities that you'll want to consider is the city of Chicago. At the young age of 183, born under the sign of Leo, a mere 234 square miles fit and trim with all the genders represented. We have a very even balance of ethnicity. Chicago loves the changing of seasons and gorging itself at summer festivals. It votes early and often with the comfort of knowing that it won't have to throw the rascals out itself. It'll just wait for their arrest warrants to be served. Yes, Chicago, Illinois, yet another eligible city out of so many at Date a City, a service that you'll want to avail yourself of in the very near future. Thank you so much. And back to you guys.
I don't know where you think of these things, Ron, but they're fun.
Where even the dead get to vote.
So. Even the dead get to vote.
Vote early, vote often.
And often.
Yes.
And if your address is a cemetery plot, don't let that stop you. So we, I tell people after the fourth governor or fifth of my lifetime ended up in prison, I stopped telling people I was from Illinois. I just appeared here in Florida out of nowhere. I just showed up one day.
I tell in fact, when I don't know if you recall, Ron, but when Joy and I were getting our CDLs some years ago, when the economy failed and support was down, everything was down, we went over the road trucking. And while we were going through school and getting our CDLs and getting our training, people kept asking us, well, you're from the Chicago area, you're from Illinois. I go, yes. And our governor was about to be arrested. Yeah, Blagojevich was about, and we kept saying, he's going to be arrested. I go, oh, no. I go, absolutely. You got to understand, Illinois, when our governors run for office, they're always elected for 2 terms. They go, how does that work? I go, well, the one they are elected for, and then the prison term that follows.
I mean, yeah, when I was a kid, Otto Kerner was in prison, and then Dan Walker was in prison, and then Dan Walker was the post-Watergate Democrat who was going to bring honesty back to government, and, well, okay. Well, there you go.
So's Hillary. She's going to do that, too.
Yeah. So back to polygamy. The next step is sexual norms. You've been doing some research on this since we set up to do this. And what have you discovered in your research, Mr. McKeever?
Well, it's not a monolithic idea to think that everybody out there is automatically assuming that this is going to happen. As I mentioned, this guy by the name of Rausch, he certainly doesn't think it should, at least. But then when you have Frederick DeVore, he's wondering, well, why are you even thinking of stopping it? He says, now that we've defined that love and devotion and family isn't driven by gender alone, why should it be limited to just 2 individuals? The most natural advance next for marriage lies in legalized polygamy, yet many of the same people who press for marriage equality for gay couples oppose it. And there are some that do. So it's interesting to listen to the various arguments that are being made. Now, being a missionary here in the state of Utah, which of course back in the 19th century was the haven for polygamy since it was announced publicly in 1852, I find that a lot of even Latter-day Saints certainly don't see this as a positive. I'm sure there's some that may see that as maybe bringing back what God had commanded, allegedly, in Section 132 of the Mormon Doctrine and Covenants. But at the same time, I don't know if a lot of people understand that plural marriage really hasn't been totally disavowed in the LDS Church. It's just not practiced the way it used to be practiced in the 19th century. And what I mean by that is polygamy is still a part of Mormon doctrine, but you can't have more than one living wife at a time. But that does not say that a Mormon male cannot be sealed for time and eternity in a marriage ceremony, in a sealing ceremony, and have individual males who are sealed to more than one wife fully believing that when they die and their wife here on earth dies, if they don't precede this individual in death, that they will be married to those women, plural, in the next life. It's called celestial polygamy or eternal polygamy. And so some Mormons, and I might say it's probably more Mormon males that like that idea than Mormon females, especially since I was recently at a Sunstone Symposium here in Salt Lake City. It was held up at the University of Utah. And the Sunstone group, they're more the intellectual Mormons. I would say that they would probably pride themselves in being more liberal in their theology. They probably wouldn't agree with a lot of the basic teachings of the LDS Church and want to define Mormonism in their own peculiar subjective way. But I went there purposely to listen to a lady speak. Her name was Carol Lynn Pearson, and she wrote a book called The Ghost of Eternal Polygamy. And this book was the result of a poll that she put out. And I don't know what the exact questions were. I've read a large portion of her book, but not all of it. But anyway, she had like 8,000 respondents to this poll that she put out there, and about 85% of the people who responded did not like the doctrine of plural marriage, either here and now or over there. They didn't like it at all. And a lot of them, I assume from what she said and what I read, were women, were Mormon women, who were very upset about this teaching, and it was actually ruining marriages, because in Mormonism there's this notion that the Mormon male can take on more wives, even in the hereafter. But the thought, for instance, she gave an example of one woman who was afraid of dying young because she knew that her husband would remarry, and being young, the chances of the one he would be remarrying was probably not sealed to another man, which means she could be sealed to her husband, which ultimately means both women would be with this person in the next life. And she was horrified at that thought. And Carol Pearson was talking about all the various people that responded and were telling their stories. And it was heart-wrenching, Don. And I tell you, it was just heart-wrenching to listen to what Carol Pearson was saying and seeing a lot of the women that were in this packed auditorium. This was in the largest room in the Student Union Center. It was standing room only. And I'm sure a lot of the women that were in this room certainly did believe that this was a teaching of the Mormon Church. I didn't hear anybody get up to the microphone and say, oh, you got it all wrong. That's not what our church teaches at all. They all seem to understand this was a doctrine of the Mormon Church today. Right. And it's causing a lot of heartache and consternation among a lot of Latter-day Saint women. And here's what I found fascinating. Because studying Mormonism for as long as I have, I think I have a pretty good idea of how the system works. And the solution that a lot of these women were talking about, and even Carol Pearson, she was talking about changing the minds of the leadership. And I'm thinking, how does that work in Mormonism when these men who claim to be prophets and apostles of God and get their information directly from the Almighty himself, how does it work? Are you really thinking you can manipulate these men into getting rid of this doctrine that probably benefits them more than the women in the church? But then how are you going to convince a guy like Russell M. Nelson, who's the next in line to become the president of the church should Thomas S. Monson pass away, and Russell M. Nelson is sealed to 2 women? Do you think he's really going to reverse this position?
Give up that? Probably not.
No, not likely. And then you have Dallin Oaks, who's also a Mormon apostle, who is also sealed to 2 women. He's sealed to his first wife, June Dixon, and then when she passed away, he was sealed to another woman named Kristen McMain. And Dallin Oaks said that Kristen was going to be his eternal companion. Well, do you think he was excluding June Dixon, his first wife? I don't think so. I think he perfectly meant that both of them were going to be his eternal companion. He just happened to be naming one of them in particular, who was probably standing next to him at the time. But how is this going to change? It doesn't work that way in Mormonism. Now, it's not that they can't come out and arbitrarily make a course correction, because they've done that before. But this is something I think would be very difficult. This isn't like giving the priesthood to black members, where all of a sudden you just go, oh, well, we don't know why that doctrine was put there in the first place, but we're just going to blame Brigham Young because he was a racist, and then we'll just throw him under the bus. And then you just make a correction and everything's good. But what do you do with
revelation?
What's that?
With African Americans in the Mormon priesthood, wasn't there a new prophecy, a new revelation that something had changed or whatever? The curse of Cain had been lifted.
Well, if there was a revelation, then we have a problem, because Brigham Young and others echoing the thoughts of Brigham Young said that the only way that blacks could hold the priesthood was that when every other of the posterity of Adam had the opportunity to receive the priesthood first. That hasn't happened yet. See, there's still people out there that can still receive the priesthood that are not of what Mormons have called the seed of Cain. So what they were teaching then is it wouldn't happen until after the resurrection.
But does the average Mormon know that Brigham Young said that?
Probably not, but the leaders should. And so when you have, for instance, Spencer Kimball in Declaration 2 talking about the lifting of this priesthood as if there was a prophecy, and like today, in June of 1978, that day has arrived. That's not true. Declaration 2 has a bald-faced lie in it. Yes, there was a prophecy, but it wasn't going to happen in 1978. That's for sure. I don't think Brigham Young ever thought that was going to happen in 78.
What role does plural marriage play in the Mormon doctrine of salvation?
Well, in the 19th century, Ron, it played a very important role, because you had Brigham Young, for instance, in 1866 saying that the only men who become gods, or even the sons of God, are those who enter into polygamy. So it was emphasized in the 19th century that Mormon males should certainly consider that, and if called to do that, that's the only way that they could hope to become exalted in the next life. Now, certainly with the country making plural marriage illegal, the Mormon Church had to make a course correction. You can't have a church full of people that you get up in a pulpit and say, I just want you to know that none of you are going to be truly saved in the next life, because we're not allowed to practice polygamy. So they just got rid of it and said, well, because the government says we can't do it, then that's our out. But the point is, it's still a part of Mormon scripture. Section 132 still talks about it. So it's not like they had a decision, well, let's get rid of Section 132. No, they didn't do that. What they did was they redefined what celestial marriage is. And now if you ask Mormons, well, what is celestial marriage? They would say, well, it means marriage for time and eternity, marriage in a temple. That's not what it meant in the 19th century. Celestial marriage was equated with plural marriage. They just changed the definition. And I think that was enough to get them off the hook, and now years and years later, nobody's the wiser.
Hmm. So it's still plural. So we have people running around, they're still getting plural celestial marriages.
Yes.
Are they doing this to secure godhood in the next life? Is that why they're doing it?
Well, I don't know. I couldn't say for sure what their personal motives are behind it, but certainly it could be for that. Although you can become a god in Mormonism without being married to more than one wife. I'm sure there's a lot of Latter-day Saints that would say, well, I have no intention of marrying more than one wife.
But isn't part of becoming a god in Mormonism to have your own planet that you will then populate? And if that's true, wouldn't it be easier to populate the planet with more wives to be part of the production?
Well, the mathematical apostle, Orson Pratt of the 19th century, said that it would have to be a god who practices polygamy to populate this earth. And so I guess that argument could be made for the Mormon who gets his own world or earth. Now, you said planet. When you say planet to Mormons, I don't know why, but they tend to cringe, even though Mormon leaders such as Brigham Young have made it very clear that they will get worlds, they will get earths, which I always wonder, well, isn't a planet just a synonym for an earth somewhere? But they get really upset about the word planet for some reason. In fact, if you go on the Mormon website on LDS.org, they have an article, and I think it's still there. It's Mormonism 101 FAQ, frequently asked questions. And one of the questions is, do Mormons believe they're going to get their own planets? And you know what the answer is? No. It says no. But yet, right now, there's 2 manuals that Mormons are using that teach that very principle. But they don't call it a planet, they call them earths or worlds. But it's still the same thing. Remember, in Mormonism, they feel that they are repeating a process that has been going on for eternity past. Just as their God was given this world as his reward for being a good human, when he lives somewhere on some other world, they believe that they will be rewarded with their own world, just the same as Heavenly Father was rewarded with this one. It's just repeating a process that goes clear into eternity past, because you have to understand, in Mormonism, there is no primary cause. They don't have a God that started it all. Brigham Young taught, how many gods there are, I do not know, but there never was a time when there were not gods and worlds. But that's only stating the problem. That doesn't solve the problem, because how did it all begin? Well, this is what's really strange. In Mormonism, you have to first be a human before you can become a god. If that's true, as many Mormons believe, then we would have to
wait. You missed a step. First, you have to be a spirit being on another planet,
yes,
and then become human.
I was trying to not be too terribly complicated here, but you're
okay.
right. And then, of course, how are we spirit children of some being who was a god? How did that begin? I mean, who was the first god let out of the intelligence, racehorse chute that got ahead of every one of us? See, Mormons don't have an answer for this, and it becomes very illogical very quickly. But the fact is, you cannot be a god without first having a body, living on some earth somewhere. That's why having a body is so important in Mormonism. Well, if that's true, then technically, according to Mormonism, if there was really a beginning, in the beginning would be man, not in the beginning God. Because you see, that God would have had to have been a man previously. So it's, and the way you're holding your forehead there, Ron, I'm thinking you're having a headache just listening to this.
Well, I'm just thinking, I think the reason that Mormons don't see how ridiculous it is because they spend so much time ridiculing our beliefs behind our backs. You hear about one of the first things you hear in, I don't know if this is still true, but I've heard it from years gone by, when they're training Mormon missionaries, they'll say the average Christian believes that God is infinite. He's so big, he's bigger than the entire universe, but he's able to still dwell within the human heart. And then the students break out laughing at this ridiculous concept.
I believe you were citing the actual temple ceremony from pre-1990. There was something very similar.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, it's like they ridicule our beliefs, which they have not taken the time to understand, and yet we take the time to understand their beliefs and find them quite ridiculous.
Well, coming from our worldview, and oftentimes when I'm speaking to a group of Christians on this subject, I want to caution them that, a lot of what you're going to hear is going to sound very odd to you coming from a biblical worldview, but you have to understand, Mormons take this very seriously. They take their beliefs very seriously, just as we take ours very seriously. And yes, there are stereotypes on both sides. There's no doubt about that. They have their stereotypes about what we believe, and I'm sure a lot of Christians have stereotypes of what they think Mormons may believe. What I try to do when I'm speaking at churches is to attack some of those stereotypes, and let's see what Mormonism really is, so that we can have a good conversation with our Mormon friends, so that they're not looking at us like, oh, these are just lazy Christians that have never taken the time to even pick up a book about what we believe. So, and that's what we try to do. So much of what we speak on when we do our 4-hour symposium and such is we're quoting primary sources. I mean, I go right to the books, and I'm going to put them up there. I'm going to quote conference messages. I'm going to quote speeches in general conference from the leadership. I'm going to quote manuals that have been vetted by the church leadership. And I tell people the reason why we're going to stick with these types of references is because these are the references Mormons are supposed to respect. They're not going to respect if you go up to them and said, well, Bill McKeever said this. Who am I? I'm a nobody. I don't have any authority to speak for Mormons. But the sources I'm citing, those are usually things that Mormons know they're supposed to believe, even though they may not.
And you just shared before we went on, you were at the temple opening, and the security people had read the material you were passing out and said
Yes.
what?
They actually, in Philadelphia, because was a temple opening going on there. I think it still is going on. And then the one in Fort Collins. In Philadelphia, the security came out and told Eric, who works with me at MRM, so that they had read the paper that he was handing out, and they were surprised at how accurate it was. I think they actually used the word surprised. And we heard the same thing during the Olympics here in Salt Lake City. We also had an 8-page handout, a Temple Square Visitor's Guide, and we also got compliments from Mormons who had read it, and they were surprised at how accurate it was. Now, they didn't agree with our conclusions naturally. Of course, they probably wouldn't agree with those conclusions, but at least they said we were portraying their faith correctly. Now, in Fort Collins, Eric had someone in security, in the Mormon security there, got a paper, read it. He came out and told Eric he didn't have a problem with anything that was said in there because he felt that we had accurately portrayed Mormonism. But when you think about it, some of the things that we have in that paper, like some of the quotations from Mormon leaders, well, concerning blacks, what we've just been talking about, you would think most people would be horrified by statements made by their presidents of the past. Yet this individual that spoke to Eric didn't seem to have a problem with it. Maybe he still believes that stuff. I don't know. But at least he recognized that we were quoting accurately the leader who said it. And that's where we have to be very important.
Now with that, I want to make a quick transition into something you might be interested in because, of course, the LDS claims to be the one true church. And one of our sponsors actually has a kit out there, the One True Church kit, which Ron wants to tell us about.
Well, yeah, it's available this week through our friends at World's End Theology Outlet. Are you troubled by the existence of countless Christian denominations? Do you tend to think that everyone's judgment is questionable except yours? Do you have a nose for excellent marketing opportunities? Well, the Heterodox Company presents the Do-It-Yourself One True Church kit. It has everything you need to shut untold millions out of God's kingdom. With the One True Church kit, you get doctrinal options, practical options, your own version of church history, proselytizing gimmicks, and so much more. You even get scores of church architectural plans and building rental options, or even non-building options if you don't believe in that kind of a thing. We have many ringing endorsements for this One True Church Kit product. A pastor in Indianapolis says, thanks to the Do-It-Yourself One True Church Kit, my disciples are so narrow they can look through a keyhole with both eyes. A pope that is in Phoenix says it's a great product. I've never had my ring kissed so many times. A church in Philadelphia says, go away. Now that we're the One True Church, we don't waste our time with spiritual peasants like you. The Heterodox Company's Do-It-Yourself One True Church Kit, everything you need to shut out untold millions from God's kingdom this week at World's End Theology Outlet. Back to you guys.
Isn't that special, the One True Church Kit?
Isn't that special?
What does a Texan mean when they say that? You know, I think they're insulting you.
Yeah. So we're getting close to the end of our time for this evening, but you had quoted a study that Roush had been talking about in his opposition to polygamy. I want to be surprised that a gay activist would be opposed to polygamy, but I'm really not, because even when they were pushing for it, and I was talking with some gay activists, and they said, well, you know, you really need to recognize that two people that love each other should be able to marry. And I would raise the specter of polygamy, and they will go, well, that is just wrong to have multiple people marry. And I said, so what you're asking is we should move the marriage line one step to include your group, but not enough to include any other groups.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, yeah. Well, you were asking about what Jonathan Roush was saying in his article, no, polygamy isn't the next gay marriage. And I think I may have touched on this a little bit, but when he says, by allowing high-status men to hoard wives at the expense of lower-status men, polygamy withdraws the opportunity to marry from people who now have it. Same-sex marriage, by contrast, extends the opportunity to marry to people who now lack it. And he's arguing the fact that if you allow polygamy, and even if you had a small percentage of men who practiced it, it would start taking away the eligible women to where males wouldn't have anybody to marry, which he says is going to cause...
Quote a study on children, though?
Well, yeah. Well, let me say that again. I want to make sure I understood you correctly.
Didn't he quote some kind of a study on children and how this would impact them?
Yes, he did. He said when it comes to monogamous marriage, and this is interesting that he says this, he says that there was a study that found that monogamous marriage, quote, results in significant improvements in child welfare, including lower rates of child neglect, abuse, accidental death, homicide, and intra-household conflict. Now, I'm positive that this study on monogamous marriage was talking about a man and a woman. In fact, study after study says that that is what's best for a child is if there is a man and a woman, a father and mother in the household. So he's using that argument to show that monogamous same-sex marriage should be the way it should be and not polygamous. So I found that to be a fascinating conclusion on his part.
It sounds like Rausch's basic premise is that if you allow polygamy, then you're going to subject the institution of marriage basically to market forces. It'll be supply and demand. It'll be, as you know, as he put it, what kind of males did he say?
High status men.
High status. Men.
Yes, to hoard wives at the expense of lower status.
You know, I don't care how much he looks like Tom Cruise. If he's broke, he's not going to hoard too many women. So really, high status seems to be another way of saying he's got resources to support these women. In other words, economic status, and therefore he's saying what we'll have is the supply of women will be hampered or will be soaked up by these guys. Marriage availability of women will be driven by market forces, and he doesn't think that that's a good thing. Now, I really question how many women are going to put themselves up for sale in this manner.
I think that's a great point. That's a great point.
You know, I mean, as attractive as it will be to some of them, you know, there's always a percentage of women who say, you know, I want to marry a rich guy, and then there's an even smaller subset of those women who say, and I want to share him with other women who also want to marry a rich guy. You know, it's really an interesting argument, but it assumes that people in their motivation for marriage are going to be driven by market forces.
Well, the problem is now marriage is defined by someone who just has a personal affection for another individual, as if that's the only reason you need, and it seems to go against the grain of why marriage has always been a part of societies throughout the world. And it was always to protect the family, to protect the potential offspring in that family. A secure family makes for a good society, so it behooves the state to get involved, and that's why you don't need a license for friendship, but you need a license for marriage. And it used to be they made it rather difficult for you to get out of that marriage relationship. Now I know it's much easier than it has been in the past, but still the whole idea of marriage was for the protection of the family and ultimately the protection of society.
Yeah.
One of our viewers, gamers, points out that some Muslims who live in Italy want plural marriage legal there, and then remarks that I guess America's next. So this question of polygamy is coming from more than one front. It's not just coming from Mormon fundamentalist groups. Will also be coming from Muslim groups as well, most likely.
I would be surprised if we did not already have in this country Muslims who are practicing polygamy. I'd be very surprised.
Yeah, I would be surprised if there aren't.
They're just
I think
under
you're
the
right. I think
radar.
they probably are. Yeah, right. Under the radar. And think about it too. Islam is kind of a protected topic in our culture too, as well as homosexuality. So as you have candidates, especially, you know, wanting to go out of their way to protect the image of Islam, you could see how that would probably be a way of getting it into our culture, is because that is a people group that you're just not supposed to say anything negative about.
Right. They get a free pass.
Yes.
Just about everything.
Right. They do. All right, you know, we are getting near the end of our time here, so we haven't really concluded if polygamy will be legal, but I am thinking it will be legal probably.
Well,
sooner rather than later.
This week, was it this week or last week that John McLaughlin died? And at the end of his program, he would always go around the room and ask for predictions. Do you remember that? The McLaughlin group, and then he would say,
yeah.
and then he would say, bye. Sometimes he wouldn't even give his own prediction. So I give it a 75% chance within the next 10 years that we will have legalized polygamy in the United States. I'm going on the record right here and now. What do you guys say?
I think 5 years. I think 10 years is too long.
I'm giving myself a lot of room here.
Yeah, I really don't know. I see, being here in Utah, I wonder how the Mormon Church is going to react to all this. That's really something that I am kind of wondering about. But I think you might be right, Ron. See, the way you worded it, 75% chance in 10 years. Okay, you're such a politician, and but I think you could be right. You could be right. And depends on who's leading the nation in the next 8 years. Could have a lot to do with that.
Well, I think this does expose I think a lot of Mormons who have even a slight awareness of their history, they realize that making polygamy illegal in their constitution was actually a prerequisite for statehood for Utah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Okay, so right there, this should suggest a little bit of cynicism here. We changed our religion in order to get something we wanted politically.
Mm-hmm.
We were landlocked, completely surrounded by this country. We were actually part of its territory. We really didn't have much choice. We wanted to be much bigger. We wanted to be the state of Deseret. We had really grand ambitions at one time, and they cut that down to size. They were all powerful. We had to knuckle under at some point, and if we wanted the rights and privileges and full representation that statehood would give us, we were going to have to go along with this. And now, when it changes, however many years later that it changes, this is going to be revisited in history texts in Utah, and it's going to be embarrassing. There's going to be some egg on the face of the church officials, and yet on the other hand, there'll be an opportunity to heal some divisions within Mormonism between the LDS and the FLDS. Maybe, I don't know. If polygamy is restored, we'll see what happens.
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting to see what happens in the next several years.
Well, we've crossed a big line culturally by making the move from viewing homosexuality as sinful behavior to accepting homosexuality as and normalizing it in some sense, to now making same-gender relationships marriage, changing the definition of marriage to include that kind of a relationship. Once you cross that bridge, I don't think it's that difficult to go to polygamy because, as you pointed out earlier, the plumbing all works. It's still male and female.
Yep.
And it doesn't seem quite as aberrational as same-gender relationships. And now with all of the stuff we have going on about, your gender is not how you are physically born or live, it is what you determine inside to be. That you are. So I could declare that I'm really a 6 foot tall black woman from Uganda. If I that's how I feel, and who can rightfully say that I'm wrong? They can't really. Once you do all of those things, which we've done, accepting polygamy is not that big of a deal.
I would tend to say you're correct on that. That's why it's. See, you're reasoning through this, and let's be serious. Our culture doesn't reason through anything. It's all about what do I want. They don't care about the consequences. This is what irritates me about this whole same-sex marriage thing and the idea of same-sex couples being able to adopt. When study after study after study shows that is not good for the children. So don't tell me it's for the children. It's not. It's all about you and your lusts. It's not about what you think about the kids.
Yes, and the way that they kind of blackmail the church is to say, wouldn't God want me to be happy? Now, God doesn't intend for us to be unhappy. That's not his first priority. But I have to confess, I believe, if I understand Scripture correctly, and you two, who are sort of our resident scholars in various areas, could correct me on this, but I believe God is far more concerned about our holiness than he is about our happiness.
Well, that seems to be the message in the New Testament. But if God is definitely concerned for our happiness, we would have to assume that that's talking about eternal happiness as well. And when you read what Paul says, and if these behaviors do not allow the unrepentant to be in heaven, then I would say, yeah, God, if God wants you to be happy, he wants you to be in heaven, then I would assume, and that so this behavior isn't going to make it.
Right, and that precludes that happiness. So
yes.
So it is time. In fact, we're past time, Ron. We have done our commercials. You probably want to do our closing credits. And
Okay.
Bill, I don't know if we had these last time you were with us or not. So if you weren't, you will be entertained, I'm sure.
You'll be enlightened by how many hands are busy helping us with our program. Our resident cult leader profiler is Neil before me. Our tinfoil hat provisioner is Justin Case. Jehovah's Witnesses coverage is provided by Armageddon and D Opposer. Our Mormon Archives manager is Polygamist. Our Liberal Denominations bureau chief is Lucy Goosey. Our transgender issues coverage is by Ben Hur. Special correspondent for cults based on the Hindenburg disaster and flying turkeys, OD Humanity. Our fact-checking supervisor is Yoleg Pulling. Our technical assistance comes through Murky Research. Our legal advisors are at the law firm of Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe. Our grievance resolutions director is Yvonne Pisami. Our director of privacy assurance, wiretapping. Original idea sourcing comes from Drew A. Blank. The Unknown Webcast is a production of Midwest Christian Outreach, Inc., in cooperation with Emergency Manicure Productions, which are fully responsible for its content, but you'll never be able to prove that in court. Back to you guys.
All right, and there you have it.
There you have it.
And we will do this again in the future. Bill, I thank you so much for being a part of this tonight.
Glad to do it, guys.
Hopefully it wasn't too painful.
Not too painful at all. No, that was fun.
Just painful enough. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, and we will see everyone next week at on the Unknown Webcast. Blessings to all.
And a B and a B and a B.